Imagine for a moment you were kidnapped to Gaza for 738 days. You come out, there's a new IDF chief of staff, there's a new president of the United States, and you turn to your family and you ask, "So, what happened on October 7th? Do we have any answers?" By and large, the answer is actually no, because many of the inquiries are either incomplete or have been withheld for one reason or another. And there's a serious question as to whether or not there will actually ever be the full truth coming to the surface. This is not new. Israel has a problem with investigations and accountability. If you look at the Bus 300 affair from the 80s, when two terrorists were killed after being arrested alive, and other issues as well, say Jonathan Pollard, one way or the other, it just happens to be that Israel does not have the greatest track record when it comes to these investigations. And Smotrich, the finance minister, gave a very fascinating interview to Ynet. Let's see when this came out. I believe yesterday. Sorry, came out 5 days ago. And it's fascinating for what it reveals here. I want to start with on October 7th, what he says. The question was, and yet your inexperience was expressed in your own admission that until October 7th, you didn't know what Nukhba, the Hamas elite terrorist was, group. You didn't know the Soleimani plan, and you didn't know that the Houthis were a threat to Israel. Ministers who heard you looked shocked. He said, I knew what Nukhbot were. I didn't know what they were planning because there was a Jericho Wall presentation, which was discovered by IDF intelligence, but was not actually presented all the way up the chain, except my understanding is that Aaron Khalifa knew about it, but the presentation was buried with some company commander. The point was that I didn't know Hamas's ground occupation plan, and it turned out the chief of staff and Southern Command colonel did not know either. That's Herzia Levy and Yaron Finkelman. And there were those who knew it and buried it deep, deep in a drawer. I'll tell you more than that. I sat with the chief of staff, Herzia Levy, 5 days before the war in my office. 2 weeks before, we had an in-depth conversation about the Northern Theater. Of course, many Israelis, certainly the defense establishment, were more concerned with Hezbollah than they were with Hamas before October 7th. Smotrich recalls that he told Herzi, quote, "You're not on track. You're treating Radwan as a terrorist infiltration while you're working against an infantry commando division that's going to occupy it, and against that you need outposts and fortifications and firepower like in the Yom Kippur War." So even the Northern Theater, which Israel was taking quote unquote more seriously, they still were not prepared properly for that. And based on my sources and what's what's been told to me, it's pretty obvious that that's the case as well. So nothing tremendously new right here. But this is where it gets interesting. Quote, I still remember the dilemmas of Shabbat on Simchat Torah between 11 and 12 a.m. I arrived at the Kiryah, the headquarters in Tel Aviv. We were sitting there in a room. The prime minister, Minister of Defense Gallant, and I, chief of staff, were on the phone debating. We still don't know if the catastrophe in the south is just a deception that Hamas created so that we would send all the forces south and then Hezbollah would attack us from the north. That's why we waited a moment. And only when the intelligence arrives and we realize that it wasn't coordinated do we send all the forces south. We weren't aware of the scope, but God did us a favor, giving us that slap, painful, difficult, a great disaster with terrible and horrible results. But this slap woke us up after many years of being asleep. So Smotrich is saying that between 11 a.m. and 12 p.m., the prime minister, the Minister of Defense, Yoav Gallant, and the Chief of Staff, Herzia Levy, are sitting in the Kiryah, and they're not sure if this is a drill or if this is the real thing. And on top of that, they still haven't established if more forces should be sent south or if they need to go up north. Now, keep in mind, it wasn't public yet, but certainly some people in the security establishment knew about the fact that Israel had the pagers and the beepers. That's not to downplay Hezbollah's threat, but it certainly was there, and it certainly was able to be used if, God forbid, Hezbollah had attacked on that day, which makes this conduct all the more confusing because you have to assume that Bibi Netanyahu knows about the pagers and the beepers, Herzl Halevi knows about it, Yoav Gallant knows about it, and the reports coming out of the South, although they weren't from Southern Command because those had been overrun, right? You have Avi Rosenfeld hiding in his office and others. But why was there hesitation? And what does that say about the Air Force? And how do you explain to people who were left burying their child's tooth, because that was all that was left after they were burned alive? How do you explain to them that you still don't have concrete answers to these kinds of questions 2 years after the event? I don't think that's unfair for some of these families to ask, how come there aren't more answers? And also, if you are saying that it's a longer process, why can't the process just be a little bit more public? The fact that Smotrich says this so cavalierly, and if that's a word, or in a more cavalier fashion, but we still don't even know what was behind all these different decisions. Of course, Gallant goes on his media tour and says that he wanted to strike Hezbollah right after October 7th. Herzl's been a little bit more quiet, but how do you get to the point that something like this happens? How are you asleep at the wheel? What have you been doing the entire time? How is this at between 11 a.m. and 12 still going on? This goes even beyond preparing in advance. This is saying, once you're in the midst of this horrible situation, how do you still not have the intelligence to figure out what was going on? I know people were reaching out on WhatsApp. They're reaching out, calling anyone they think might have a connection. But how is it at the point that you're sitting in the Kiryat, you're sitting in the headquarters of the and you still don't have an idea of what the heck is going on in the South? This is highly concerning. Clearly, we saw the result of October 7th and what happened. And it brings into focus even more so why there needs to be a complete, thorough investigation and things need to be put out right in the open. I'm not sure if it has to be amnesty and that people will speak without financial and or criminal consequence, but this pattern of decision making has to be completely reevaluated. And people say, well, look at the success after. Has nothing to do with it. People can be successful in one field and terribly unsuccessful in another. So the same people who were training and did an excellent job with Iran could have done an absolutely horrendous job and did do an absolutely horrendous job when it came to October 7th. I think it's the least that they could do for the families of the victims to come very clean and explain exactly what happened. And for those who rely on the defense of the IDF and the security establishment to present lessons that were learned to prevent things like this in the future. I don't think that's unfair either. So just seeing the Smotrich interview really got me going to an extent. There needs to be some sort of inquiry. There has to be a real accounting of what happened without trying to cover up any of the truth. Again, Israel has a history of trying to cover up some of this truth. It's extremely important going forward that everything from the lack of equipment to the lack of an idea, even between 11 and 12 o'clock, that the focus was really in the South, to how there was just such a discombobulation, it has to be dealt with, and it has to be dealt with in an ethical and straightforward fashion. I know everyone is extremely happy about the 20 released living hostages and is nervous about the fact that there are still 19 deceased hostages held by Hamas. Not taking away from any of those issues, but there also simultaneously has to be a very, very thorough investigation into what the heck happened on October 7th. And it has to be honest and it has to be straightforward. Nothing less will do.